Today we're going to learn how to build a JavaScript gallery, which is something that has been requested quite frequently inside my HTML and CSS course, since we did actually build a HTML and CSS gallery, but we never learned how to open the images inside full view inside the browser once you actually click them. So today we're going to learn how to build a JavaScript gallery. So what you're going to need in order to actually be able to do this episode is basic knowledge in HTML and CSS, and you don't really need to know anything in JavaScript, but it would help if you knew a little bit in JavaScript, because I will go through the JavaScript code step by step so you know exactly what it does. But again, the more JavaScript you know, the more it's going to be easy for you to understand it. That's just how things are. So inside my gallery, I have all these images here. And as you can see, we will also learn how to insert images that can stretch down this way. You might not know it, but this is actually something that is quite tough to do if you do it the old CSS way. So using the newer CSS, or more specifically CSS Grid, we will be able to insert images like this that goes down and takes up 2 spaces instead. So this is something we'll be able to do. Now the JavaScript part is that when I do actually click one of these images, you can see that it opens up into full view, and we can then switch images by clicking the next button on the side here. So this is something that we have to be able to do in order to view a gallery, because that sort of makes sense that when you make a gallery, you should be able to view the images. So this is what we're going to be building today. Inside my text editor, and I will be using Visual Studio Code in case you want to know what text editor I'm using here. Doesn't matter which text editor you do use, but Visual Studio Code here is the one that I prefer for this episode here. It has very good syntax, so I thought this one might be a good one to sort of promote today. I'm not sponsored, I just wanted to mention that. Inside this text editor, I have a couple of different files, and I just want to explain why exactly I have those files and why we're going to be using these files. So inside my CSS folder, as you can see, I have a couple of different folders inside my root directory, which is the place where you have your website. I have an index file, which is the one you see right in front of me here. I also have a CSS folder, a image folder, and a JavaScript folder. Inside my CSS folder, I have a reset style sheet. If you've never learned about a reset style sheet before, I do have a video on it, so if you want to see it, I will leave a link for it in the description. So I went ahead and included this reset style sheet inside at the top of my index page. As you can see, I have 3 different style sheets. I have my reset one, which is the first one. You have to make sure that is the first one. Then I have something called a main.css file. This is where I insert all the main styling that is not going to be part of the gallery specifically, but just a main styling of my website. So for example, different wrappers, default styling for my paragraphs, for my title. I also went ahead and included my header stylings in here, since the header is going to appear on all my web pages. But in here, I have some styling for my current website. Now, this is going to be the final product, right? This is not the one that I'm showing right now inside my text editor. What I styled inside my main.css file is I just inserted a header at the top here that has a navigation in it and a logo on the side. That's all I did. So everything else you see below here with the gallery is going to be inside my gallery.css file, which is going to be right here. As you can see, there's nothing in here right now because we haven't started yet. And since I get a lot of complaints from people who wants to see me do all the styling, and people who say that styling is a waste of time, I should just show how to do the JavaScript or the PHP or whatever course I might be doing. There's always people that sort of, disagree there, but I will be showing the CSS in this episode since I think it's quite important, at least for the gallery part. I'll be showing the CSS. Again, if you do want to have all my files that I'm using in this episode, you can go to my Patreon. I have a link in the description, and you can download the entire project here. Do keep in mind, I'm not leaving anything out regarding the gallery that we're building today in those files. This is just in case you made a mistake and you don't know, how to correct it, and you might want to see my files and see, sort of compare them next to each other. You can do that using my Patreon. So we're going to be styling the gallery.css together. Now, before we do anything, we're just gonna take this step by step because I don't wanna jump back and forward files too much because that might confuse you too much. So what I'm going to do to start with here is I will go ahead and start with the index file, and then we're just gonna take it from there. We're gonna finish off the index file. Then we're gonna go to the gallery.css file. We're gonna finish that one, or at least as much as possible, before we start the gallery.js file, because I also have a JavaScript file inside my JavaScript folder called gallery.js. JS. This is going to be the one that takes care of everything regarding the gallery, meaning that we open up the image, we switch to the next image, we close down the image again using this specific file here. I do also have an image folder, and just to sort of explain what I did in here. Now, it is quite important you do this the same way as I did in order to get this working the same way. Again, there's a lot of ways you can build a gallery using JavaScript. This was just the way that I came up with. And by the way, I just want to mention, I'm not using any sort of frameworks. I'm not using any sort of libraries. This is pure JavaScript. So this is something that everyone will be able to just sort of follow along on, even if they don't know how to install libraries like jQuery or something. Inside my image folder, I have a couple of different images. I have a background image that we're not really going to use for anything, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. That is not going to be part of this episode here. And I also have a couple of extra logo images. We don't actually need to have those either, so just bear with me here. I'm just going to delete the images that we don't need to have. So as you can see, I have my images in here. These are the full images, by the way. These are the ones that are, full quality, high resolution. And then I have my logo down here at the bottom. Do you notice that when I named these images, I called them img1.jpg, img2.jpg, img3. You sort of get the idea. I named them and gave them a number. The number you give these images are going to be the order in which they're going to appear inside your gallery. This is important to note. So do make sure that you name these in the order that you want them to show up inside your gallery. I do also have a thumbs folder inside my image folder. Inside of this one, I have all the thumbnails that you're going to see inside the website, just to show you what I mean. This image that you see right here, that is very tiny and I can click on in order to open it up, is not the same image as this one. It's very important to note, because when you load your website, if I were to refresh my website, you see it loads very fast, you barely notice it. That's because these thumbnails are much lower resolution than these images are. So it's very important that you have two separate images, one that is low resolution. I usually say I just take the width as 1000 pixels for all the images for the thumbnail, and then I just do the full resolution for the big image, unless it's like incredibly big resolution. So you might want to scale it down if it's too big. So going back inside our text editor, I'm just gonna go ahead and close down my image folder. Again, if you don't have any images to use for this episode, just go ahead and download something. I will leave a link for a place where you can download royalty-free images in the description. So go down there, get a couple of images, and then resize them in Photoshop or something if you have Photoshop, and then return to the episode once you have the images ready. It's very important we have images, otherwise we can't do a gallery inside our website. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start with our index.html file. So what I did here is I created my header section. And again, this is not something that I should teach you because it's just a basic header for a website. You can make this however you feel like. This has no effect on the gallery. So please stop writing in the comment section that I'm leaving out code because I didn't show you the styling or the HTML for the header in detail, because this is something that you should be able to do by now. After the header, we're gonna actually start the actual gallery. So down here, I'm gonna create a section. And I'm going to do a couple of different things to this section here. What I'm going to do to start with is I want to make sure I insert just a small paragraph or title for my gallery, because that usually goes with a gallery. So let's just go ahead and create a paragraph. I'm gonna call this one Daniel Nilsson, which is my name, just so people know whose gallery it is. Then I might want to include a title. So I'm going to say I have an H2 here. So now we just have some basic titles here. You don't need to have this, but if you want to have titles, this is something you could do. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to insert the actual images. And I did have to sort of decide for this episode if I wanted to do that using JavaScript or if I wanted to do that using HTML and CSS. And because I know that some people who are watching this episode might not be JavaScript experts, it might make more sense to do this using HTML and CSS. And again, I think that the JavaScript way is just an alternative way to do it. Might not necessarily be a better way to do it. So, we're just doing it the HTML and CSS way here. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to insert a div. And this is not something that has to be a specific type of HTML element. We're just going to insert a basic div for this. I'm going to go ahead and give this one a class. And the class is going to be equal to two things. It's going to be equal to gallery. image, gallery dash image. This is one styling. And I'm also going to include a second class, and it's going to be called image1. So now you can see that we're sort of getting into something here where each div is going to be the images that we're inserting into the gallery, so the thumbnails. Afterwards, I'm going to create another div inside this div box here, because if I were to go back inside the full example, you can see when I hover on these thumbnails, I have this black overlay that is a little bit transparent, but there's a black overlay with a title of the image inside of it. This is what we're going to create right now. So in order to do that, what I decided to do is I'm creating a second div, which is going to be the black background, and then I'm going to create an anchor tag inside of it, and then inside the actual text, we can insert the title for the actual image. Now, right now, I don't really have any titles for my images, so I'm just going to say, this is a title. Again, you can call it the actual title of your images if you want to. I don't have a title here, so I'm just going to do something default. So now that we have this, we actually have the first image. So now we're going to copy this, paste it down, and I have 7 images inside my gallery. So I'm going to do it 7 times. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then I'm just going to go ahead and change the names accordingly. So the first one is image1 inside the class. The second one's going to be image2, image3, image4, image5, image6, and image7. The reason we need to have these individually is because using CSS grid a little bit later, we do need to define a grid area for each section here. So to sort of tell it whether or not we want the image to stretch down in 2 spaces or maybe across 2 spaces if we want to do that. So that's something we need to do in order to be able to define that. Now, when it comes to linking to the JavaScript file, you can link a JavaScript file either at the top here inside the head tag, you can do it inside the body tag, or you can do it after the body tag at the end here. The important thing about this specific JavaScript file is that we do need to have the images loaded in order to do something to the images using JavaScript. So I do want to make sure that I included after all the images and stuff has been loaded. So I'm going to do it right before we close off the body tag here. So I'm going to insert a script tag, and I'm going to link to my JS folder and the gallery.js file, like so. So now we link to the JavaScript file, and we're actually completely done with the index page, which is kind of nice. So what we can do now is we can jump into our CSS file, because we do need to style this section we just created here. Okay, so we did actually need to do one more thing inside the index page, which is going to be the last thing. Inside the actual section text that is wrapped around our gallery, we do need to include an ID and a class. So we're going to say we want to have a ID, set it equal to, double quotes, and then I want to call this one index-gallery, just to know that this is the gallery section inside our index page. Then I want to include a class, and I want to call this one wrapper-gallery. Now the wrapper-gallery has been defined inside my main.css file. So just in case you do want to have this, I have a wrapper-gallery that simply has a margin set to 0 and 20 view width, which is the view width of your current browser. So this is what I have for my gallery. Again, the margin can be whatever you want it to be. It's just personal preference here. So inside our gallery.css file, the first thing I want to do is I want to style the index-gallery ID that we have for the container for the entire gallery. So what I want to do here is I want to say index-gallery, and I want to go ahead and style it. Inside the styling here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say we want to display this as a grid type. And if you're not familiar with a grid when it comes to CSS, I do have an episode on it that I will leave a link for in the description. Basically, we can create layouts inside our website using a grid, which is something that is quite new. And when I say quite new, it's a couple of years old, but it is something that I see a lot of people are still not using. And I think it's a really cool feature. So we're going to use CSS grid in order to create a cool layout for our gallery here. So we're going to display this as a grid. There we go. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to define the specifics of this grid that we're building here. You know, how many columns do we want to have? How do we want to display the rows? You know, do we want to define a gap between the grid items? And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define the columns inside our grid. So we're going to say we want to create a grid dash template dash columns. So we need to define how many columns and how large should they be. Now I'm going to use one fraction. I'm going to do that 4 times to define that I want to have 4 different columns going down. So the gallery right now is 4 columns, and they should each be individually spaced. So whatever width they have available to them should be divided evenly out throughout that space. After we've done this, we can go ahead and define a grid template row. And I'm just going to set this one to auto. We're also going to go ahead and define a grid gap. Let me just go ahead and show you inside the actual website here. We're going to set this one to 10 pixels. And if you can tell inside my website, we do actually have a gap in between all the different gallery items. And this gap here is what we're defining right now using this grid here. Now, there is one more thing we need to do in here, but I'm not going to do it just quite yet because it might not make sense for you unless we have some other CSS styling as well. So let's go ahead and continue downwards. And we're just going to go ahead and copy paste what we have here. Copy paste. And instead of styling the container, we're going to go ahead and style the actual images inside the container. Now, we do have 2 types of classes. We have one called gallery-image. And then we have one that is called image1, or depending on the image, is going to be a separate number. So the gallery image is going to be the default styling for all the different images we have inside the gallery. The image 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on are going to be the individual stylings of each image, if that makes sense. Because by doing it that way, we don't have to double create a bunch of CSS styling inside the different images. We can just do it in one place, and then the whatever styling has to be different, we do in separate stylings. So in here, what I'm going to define first is that we're going to say, well, first of all, we're not styling the index-gallery. We're instead styling the class called gallery-image. IMG. In here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a width for the individual images. Now, do keep in mind, we do have a grid going, and it's automatically going to assign a certain width to all the images. But the actual image, in order for the image to stretch inside the grid container to the edges, we do actually need to define a 100% width. Then I'm going to go down and define how tall I want each image to be. Now, this one you can decide for yourself. How tall do you want your gallery images or the thumbnails inside the gallery images to be? I decided to make it into 300 pixels, which means that it's going to be 300 pixels going from the top to bottom. You can always change this into something else. So going back inside our styling, I'm going to call it 300 pixels. And now we just need to define the actual images that are going to be inserted as backgrounds inside these different gallery image containers here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, we're going to have a background dash repeat, and it's going to be set to no repeat. Then I want to define a background size, and I want to set this one to cover. It's essentially that it should cover this entire square here. That's what we're doing. We're going to define one last thing regarding the background image, which is going to be where it should be positioned, and we're going to center it. We do need to do one more thing here, so I'm going to set that we also want a cursor, which means that when I put my mouse cursor on top of the image, I want it to, have this little hand symbol that we usually get. You can actually see it right now. This little hand symbol here we want to have. So I'm going to set this one to pointer. So now that we have this, we're actually done styling the default styling for all the different images. Let's actually go ahead and open up the current one that we're actually working on right now. So if we were to go in here and open it up, you can actually see that this is how it looks like right now. Now, the reason we don't have anything in here is because, first of all, we didn't actually position these inside the grid like they're supposed to be, which is why I waited with doing that at the top there. Remember, I said that we need to have one more thing up here. That's going to be like where the images needs to be positioned, as well as the title inside the gallery. Because remember, we did also create a paragraph and an h2 tag. Those also needs to be placed inside here. So going back inside our gallery, the CSS file, we're actually going to be styling the individual images that we have inside our gallery. So going down to the next line, I'm going to just create a comment because that might be a good idea so we know exactly where the images are. I'm going to say images, and then I'm going to say we want to style, first of all, let me just go ahead and copy what we have here. First of all, I want to go ahead and style the first image. So instead of referring to the gallery-image class, which was the default styling, I'm going to say we have something called img1, which was the class we referred to inside the first image. Then I want to say that I want to create a grid-area. And what the grid-area does is that it sort of labels a name for this specific image here that we can then use inside the above index gallery styling, because we will return to this one, just create the last piece of styling. For now, just go ahead and give this one a name. So I'm going to call this one img1. That's going to be the name for that one. Then I also want to include the actual link to the image that is going to be displayed inside this specific image here. So I'm going to say I want to create a background dash image URL parentheses, and inside the parentheses I want to actually link to the actual image that I want to be shown inside what we have here. So right now we're inside our CSS folder, so I need to go back one directory. Then I need to go inside my image folder, and then inside my thumbs folder, because these are the thumbnails, these are not the actual full images. And then I want to link to image 1, the JPEG. Now that we did this, we can actually go ahead and copy paste. We had 7 images, so we need to do this 7 times. I think that was 7. And I'm just gonna go ahead and change everywhere where it says 1 to a 2, because that is the easy way to do it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and change the next one to 3. Then the next one to 4. And you can sort of see how this is just very simple to do. You just gotta change it 3 different places inside the class name, inside the grid area label that we created, and also inside the link we have down there. So now that we have these, we also have the paragraph and the h2 tag that we inserted inside our image gallery section here. So let's also go ahead and include those. So I'm going to say we have just go ahead and copy paste. We have 2 more. We have a paragraph, and we also have an h2 tag. And what I want to do here is I don't want to link to any sort of background image. I just sort of want to give them a grid area label. So I'm just going to call this one something like gallery-p. Let's actually spell that correctly. There we go. Then I want to do the same thing for below here, gallery-h2. Let's go ahead and return up to our container, which is the index-gallery ID we have up here. And inside of here, I'm going to create something called a grid template areas. And then what we can do in here is we can actually define how we want these to be laid out inside our actual website. So if I were to just say what we have here really quick, just to show you what we have, you can see that we have all the different images, but they're all in the same place, and it doesn't make sense. And that's because all the images are on top of each other right now, and we need to tell it where do we want to place these images inside the grid we created. Right now it's just placed over in this grid over here, but we need to spread them out. So inside our styling, I'm going to say, well, we have the first row in here, and I want to go ahead and say, well, I want to grab, first of all, the gallery-p, which is going to be the paragraph, and I want to insert that one into the first row. Now, do keep in mind we have 4 columns. So in the first row, I'm going to copy paste in gallery-p 4 times to make sure it has the entire row for itself. Then I want to go down to the next line, and do make sure that you don't have this semicolon after each line. It should only be after the last line. That is important. And then I'm going to create a second row. In here, I want to have the h2 to just have that row for itself. So again, paste it in 4 times. Then I want to go down 1 more line for the next row. And now we need to start inserting the images. So what I want to do here is I want to take my first image, paste that inside the first space inside the grid, space. Then I want to insert the second image, space. Then I want to insert the third image. And now keep in mind, in my example here, I do have an image, if you go back to the full version, that stretches down 2 spaces. We need to keep that in mind for the next row. Okay, so that's the third image. This is 1, 2, and the third image. So going back in here, going to insert image 4. And now that we go down to the next row, we're going to insert image 5, then image 6. And for the next one here, we want the third image to stretch down 2 spaces going downwards. So I'm going to insert image 3 again to say that it's allowed to go down there. And then image 7. Okay, does that make sense? Image 3, 2 spaces here. That is how it's supposed to look like. Good. So now that we have this, we essentially have something called a grid. So if we were to go back to our current version we're working on, refreshing, you can now see that we're splitting them up in here. Now, one thing you're going to notice here as well is that our third image that is supposed to go down there does not actually go down there. And there's a very good reason for why this is happening. So if I were to go back inside my styling, we do actually need to go down to the third image down here and include one more piece of styling, which is going to be a height for this image that we have right here. Now, the height that we're going to set here is going to be equal to the default styling we set up here that we set to 300 pixels for all the images. We're going to change that one from 300 to 300 plus 300 because we're going downwards a second space. But we also need to make sure that because we have a gap set to 10 pixels, that we add that to it as well. So going down here, inside image number 3, we're going to set this one to 610 pixels. So you do need to make sure that you change the height for the images that you want to cover 2 spaces going down. That is something you need to do manually. So having done this, we can actually go back inside our website, refresh, and as you can see, we now have the gallery that we want to have in here. Now, the titles haven't really been styled yet, and we have no hover effect when we hover over the images. Don't worry, we'll get to that. So going back into our code or inside our CSS file, I'm going to go down all the way to the bottom, and the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to style the things that are inside the images. So the background that turns black and the what do you call the actual titles that pop up, we're going to style those things inside here. So going down, we're going to create another comment just so we know exactly what we're dealing with. Then we're going to go down and I'm going to style the gallery dash image, which is the default styling we're referencing to for all the images. Again, you sort of know that by now. And then I want to reference to the div that is inside our image. So the div tag that is inside our images, you know, the individual images. Then I want to open up the curly brackets. And in here, we're going to set the styling for the black background that we have in there. So I want to set a width to 100%. It should also go all the way from top to bottom. So we're going to set a height as 100%. Then we want to set a background color, and I want to set this one to a very dark color. So we could just set it to black. There we go. For the opacity, we're going to set it to 0 because we don't want to see it just quite yet. We only want to see the background when we hover the cursor on top of the images. So we're going to create a hover effect afterwards that is going to set the opacity to something a little bit bigger than 0 because 0 means we can't see it. After the opacity, we're going to create a flex box. If you haven't learned about flex box yet, I do also have a video on that. So again, in the description of this video here, you can learn about flex box. So we're going to create a display as flex. And then I want to set a couple of different parameters for this specific flex that we're creating here. The first one is going to be, do I want to center the content horizontally? And do I want to center it vertically? Which is a very easy way to center elements using flex or flexbox. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say justify content. And I want to set this one to center. Then I want to also align items to center. And just by doing this, all the content that is inside this box here is going to be centered. Like completely centered. It's a very cool way to do it, and we didn't have it in the past, like many years ago, but it's something we have now, which makes things a lot easier. So what I'm going to do now is going back inside our index page just to see what we're dealing with here. So right now we styled this div tag that is around the actual title. Now we need to style the anchor tag. I'm just going to copy paste what we have here, and I'm going to delete what we have inside of here. Then I'm going to say that we don't want to style the div, but the anchor tag that we have in here. I'm going to set a font family, font-family. Again, I don't have any sort of special fonts imported. I'm just going to use Arial because that is just a standard font. I'm not really crazy about these standard fonts, but they're what we have right now. So we're going to set a font size, font-size, and I'm going to set this one to 18 pixels. We're also going to add a color. I'm going to set the color to white. Then I want to set a text decoration to none, because when you use a anchor tag inside any sort of website, it will have an underline under it as a default. We want to remove that, so I'm going to say none. Then I also want to say text transform and set it to uppercase because I want my text to be uppercase inside the titles here. So now we styled the text, and what we need to do next is we need to style the hover effect that is going to happen once I put my cursor on top of the div box, because I want the black background to actually appear once I do that. So going down here, I'm going to insert or just copy paste my div styling, and I'm going to say :hover afterwards inside the path, and I want to change the opacity. So I'm going to say I want to delete everything except the opacity, which I'm then going to set to 0.8. So not completely black background, but a little bit transparent still, because I still want to see the background image that is behind there. We do need to do one more thing, because right now it is going to change very suddenly. I want to have a smooth transition to the fading of the title and background. So I'm going to say transition and set this one to all, ease in and out, and just about 100 milliseconds I think is fine. Save this, go back inside your website and refresh, and now you can see we have something that looks a lot closer to what I have here. Now, of course, I do also have some spacing in my live example or the finished version from underneath the H2 tag. Just go ahead and include that if you need to have that. As you can see, there's a little bit of space missing. It doesn't really matter for the gallery, but if you want to have that, you can just go ahead and style the H2 tag there. Now, before we do anything else using CSS, we're going to jump into our gallery.js file, because I think we're going to be jumping a little bit back and forward into the CSS file and the JavaScript file, which I hope is not going to get too confusing for you. I'll try to explain it as well as I can why we have to go back and forward. So for now, let's just go ahead and start with the gallery.js file, which is going to be our JavaScript code. So inside our gallery.js file, the first thing we're going to do is we have 3 different variables that we need to set in order to sort of keep track of certain things when it comes to this gallery. For example, what is the last image we opened up? How many images do we have in here that are actually inside the galleries? You know, things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable, a let type variable would probably be preferred. We're going to call this one gallery images. Going to set this one equal to documents dot query selector all parentheses semicolon. And what we're basically doing here, for people who are not that familiar with JavaScript, is that we're saying, okay, we're creating a variable, which is a type of container that can contain information. And we want to set this equal to all the gallery images we have inside our gallery. So I'm saying we have a document, which right now is our index.html file. And inside this document, I want to select all elements that has a certain class part of it. So I want to say all the ones that has gallery-img inside of them. Once I did that, all the images are going to be set equal to this variable here, so we can now refer to it later on. So that was a quick catch up on what a variable is. Again, we're not going to talk too much about that because it's very basic JavaScript. So there's some people watching as well that do know JavaScript. We're also going to go ahead and set a variable that I'm going to call getLatest opened image. And I'm not going to set this one equal to anything, because this is just one that's going to keep track of what the latest opened image is. Because we haven't opened any images yet, it's not going to be equal to anything. Then I'm going to set a third variable that is going to be called window width. It's going to be equal to window dot inner width. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying that I also want to grab the current width of the window we have inside the browser. So I'm going to say we want to reference to the window we're inside of, which is an object in itself. Then I want to get a property called inner width. So the total width of our browser window is what I'm storing inside this variable here. So now what I want to do is I want to actually create the JavaScript code that goes in and does something whenever we click on one of the images. So the first thing I'm going to do using an if statement is I'm going to go ahead and run a condition to check whether or not there actually is any images inside this website here. So I'm going to say I want to grab my gallery images variable and just sort of run it inside my if statement. This is going to return false if we don't have any images, and it's going to return true if we do have any images. Inside of here, we then need to grab all the elements that has this class attached to it. Right now, if I were to just create an onClick function, which means that if I were to click on one of the images, something needs to happen, then it's only going to do it to the first image if I were to reference to the gallery images up here. So it's very important that we sort of loop through all the elements and run this function down here on all the elements that we're grabbing from inside our website. So all the images that we have needs to run a function on all of them individually. I think I just repeated myself there. So inside our if statement, I'm going to, again, reference to gallery images. Then I want to run a for each function that is going to simply go in, and for each element that we have inside gallery images, it's going to do something to them. So in this case here, I want to run a function for each one of these. So I'm going to say we have a function, parentheses, and inside this function here, we're going to insert a couple of different parameters. For now, we're just not gonna do it because I want to create them as we do need to use them, so you know exactly why we need to have them. We're also gonna go ahead and close off the function with curly brackets and move it down to the next line. So now it looks like this. Hopefully it's not too confusing and too technical for you at the moment. I do actually have a error here. We do need to change the comma into a punctuation. Make sure you do that. Now for this next section here, I'm going to try and explain this as simple as I can. Right now we have this variable up here that has all the images that has this class attached to it stored inside this variable. And they're going to get stored in here as an array, meaning that we have a container with many different images inside of it. Now, this function down here is going to be a function that allows for us to, when we click on the image, open the image up and actually see it in full view. But we need to do that on all the images inside this array up here, okay? So inside the function here, we need to reference to the element that we clicked on that has this class attached to it, which means that inside this function down here, we need to have a keyword that actually references to the first element inside the array up here. And that keyword needs to be inserted as the first parameter inside our for each method here. This method has many different parameters inside of it we can set if we want to. The first one is sort of required to set, which is going to be the actual element that we have inside this array up here. And we need to insert that inside our function here. So I'm going to say we have a image. And this is going to be the keyword whenever we need to reference to the actual element inside this array up here. So inside of here, I want to reference to the actual element, which is the first element or the first image that we have inside this variable up here. And I want to run a onClick event on this image here. So I'm going to say we have a onClick event, which means that when we click the image, then I want to set it equal to another function. Now this function here is going to get run whenever we click on any of the images inside our gallery. So if I were to alert something here, just to sort of show you, say alert, it works. Let's just go ahead and save that, go inside our browser, refresh. You can see when I click, it says it works for all the images we have in here. If I did not use the for each method, the one that we have right here, then it would only work for the first image, which is why we need to do it in this sort of complicated way. So now that we have this and we actually demonstrated that it does actually work inside our website, what I need to do now is I need to actually get the image that I want to display in full view, because right now we just have this thumbnail here, but I want to grab the full image version so I can display it in a full view. So we need to grab that image inside our image folder, which is right here. So all these images here, actually no, these images here we need to grab, not the ones inside the thumbs folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this one get element CSS. And I'm going to set this one equal to window dot get computed style. Now, we haven't talked about get computed style inside my JavaScript course. The essential way this one works is that we get all the styling from inside the CSS file. So not inline styling, that is a little bit different. If I were to go inside my index page, if I were to take one of the HTML elements, if I want to run a style equal to double quotes, this would be inline styling. That is very easy to grab using JavaScript. But if you want to grab CSS file styling, it's going to be very different. So inside my JavaScript file, I want to grab all the styling that we have applied to this element here, or this image that we're right now clicking. And when I do that, it means that we're going to grab the background image URL as well, because that is going to be part of that styling. So once we have this styling here, we can go ahead and take this URL and break it down so we know exactly what the image number is that we clicked on. That's what we're going to do now. We need to figure out which image have we clicked on in order to actually show the full version of that image inside our browser. So going back inside our JavaScript file, we're going to go down to the next line and we're going to set another variable type. We're going to get this one, get full image URL. I'm going to set this one equal to get element CSS dot get property value, parentheses, and then close it off. Now, what we're going to do here is we have this long list of CSS that is applied to our main image here, or the image that we're referencing to. And I want to get a specific styling property. That's what we're doing here. We want to get the element CSS, which is right now this image here. And I want to get a specific property, which is going to be, in this case here, the background image property. So right now we're getting the whatever is applied to the image background inside our CSS file, which means that we're going to get this right here. That's what we're getting. We're getting the URL for the actual image. So now that we have the URL for the image that is used for the thumbnail, we can now break it down and get the image for the full image using a little bit of JavaScript magic here. So going down to the next line, I'm going to create another variable and I'm going to call this one get image URL position, or pos for position. I'm going to set this one equal to the get full image URL we have up here, because that is going to be the value of the background image of this image here. And I want to split it. I'm going to run something called a split method. Now this method here is going to take this whatever value we have up here, which is right now the URL for the thumbnail image, and it's going to allow for us to split it apart, because I just need the last half of it. So I'm going to say that we have inside this URL, maybe I should actually go ahead and alert this out so you can see what I'm trying to do here. Let's go ahead and alert get full image URL and actually see it inside the browser. So if we were to refresh, you can see we have this long URL here. If we were to go down to the last part of the URL, we have our image folder, our thumbs folder, and then the image name. So that's the part I want to grab. I just want to grab that last part. So what I want to do is I want to go inside my JavaScript here, and I want to say I want to split it, and I want to split it at the part of the URL where it says image / thumbs / So now that we did this, this variable here contains two pieces of data because we split the URL into two pieces of chunks. So it's going to have the first part, which we don't need because that's just mess. We don't need that part of the URL. The second part, however, is going to contain the actual last part of the URL, which is going to be the image name and the image position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this get image URL position, and I'm going to copy it and create a new variable. I'm going to call this one set new image URL. So we're going to create a new URL for the image, set it equal to this variable we have up here, called get URL position. And I'm going to reference to the second index inside that array. Now in JavaScript or in any sort of programming language, we start at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So the first index is going to be 0 and the second index is going to be 1. So having grabbed the last part of this split up here that we created, the last part of the URL, what I can do is I can actually run a replace method that is going to go in and remove a little bit of this URL. Because let me show you, if I were to again alert this, what we have, let me go and alert the get image URL position, the second part of it, so the first index, and go inside the browser, refresh. You can see that right now we get the name of the image, but we also get this weird double quote parentheses at the end. So we need to remove that inside the URL, otherwise we can't use this. So we're going to run another method called replace, and I'm going to say that I want to go in here and I want to replace a double quote and a parentheses with nothing. So we're just gonna go ahead and say we want to replace this with nothing, and that way we just sort of get rid of it. So once we've done that, we now have the new URL for the image. If we were to actually alert this out, just to show you, you can see that now we only get the image name. We don't have any sort of noise or mess inside the URL for the image. We only have the name for the image. So with this, we now have the actual name for the image that we just clicked on inside our gallery. So the next thing we need to do is I want to go ahead and set this variable up here and say, okay, when I click this image, that was the last image we just clicked on. So we're going to set this variable up here. So I'm going to just sort of copy paste it in, and I want to set it equal to the current image that we're right now clicked on. Now we could do something very messy and complicated, very similar to what we just did, or I could go inside my function up here where I inserted the first parameter, which is the element we clicked on, and include a second parameter. And I'm just gonna call this one index. Now what this second parameter does is that it counts the current index of this array that we have up here. So we have all the images inside an array, and it's going to count which position inside the array it is. So if I click the first image, it's going to be positioned at number 0, because remember I mentioned that we start at 0 in JavaScript, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So the first image inside the gallery is going to be called 0. So if I were to copy paste the index in here, it will now say that get latest opened image is going to be equal to 0. But just to sort of make this a little bit more sensible to us, because right now if I were to click the first image inside the actual gallery, it is going to be image number 1, at least in the URL it says image number 1. So I want to go ahead and add 1 to this, just to make sure that it's somewhat more easy to deal with when it comes to figuring out what the image was I just clicked on. So now that we have that, we can go down, and the next thing we need to do is we need to create the actual pop-up window that is going to pop up on the screen and actually show the image inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call this one let container, and I'm going to set this one equal to document.body. Because when I create this pop-up window, we need to define where do we want to create the pop-up window. And I'm just going to go and create it in the body of our page. So having done this, we can now say we want to create a second variable. I'm going to call this one new image window. I'm going to set it equal to document.create element, parentheses, semicolon. And inside this create element method here, we're going to tell our JavaScript code that we want to create a new element that we want to insert into our web page, or a new node, as you might call it. So we're going to create something called a div, which is going to be just a regular div box that is going to have the image inside of it when it pops up on the screen. And I also want to go ahead and actually create this one. So after we created this element, the next thing we need to do is we need to actually apply the element to our actual body of our website, because even though we created, we haven't actually attached it inside our website. So going down here, I'm going to say that I want to reference to the container, and then I want to say .append child, which is another JavaScript method that is going to apply the div to the body of our website. So if we were to actually do this, and then reference to the new image window that I'm going to append to it, we now have a div image or div box inside the website when we do actually click on one of the images. So just to sort of demonstrate, let's go back to the website. And if we were to refresh, when I click one of these images, let's actually go and inspect it. Otherwise you can't see it, what exactly is happening here. If I were to click it and then go down here, you can actually see that we have a div box down here at the bottom. You might not be able to see it, it's not that big. But we do actually have a div box created at the bottom here that keeps popping up. So this div box is going to be the container for the actual image once we do actually create it. So going back inside our code, what we're now going to do is we're going to set a couple of different attributes for this div box here that is going to be the full width of the entire browser. So we're going to say we have this new element we created called new image window, and I want to set a attribute to it. I'm going to set an attribute, which is first of all going to be a class. So we're going to create a class attribute inside this element here. And I want to set this one equal to image window, image-window. Okay, so now we created a class for this element. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a second attribute. And this one is going to be a onClick event, which is going to run a method or function inside our JavaScript file here called close image. And we do actually need to make sure we add the parentheses to it. So what we're doing here is we're adding first of all a class so we can style it inside our CSS file, which means that we're going to return to our CSS file in just a second. And we also added a onClick event, which means that when I do actually click on this big container here, it is going to close down the image using a function we haven't created yet. We're going to do that a little bit later. So having created this, let's actually go ahead and go back inside our CSS file. I'm going to go ahead and create the CSS styling for this image that is going to pop up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a comment to make it easier for us. Then for the actual styling, I'm going to say I want to reference to the image window class. And remember, this is the class that we applied to this file or to this div using our set attribute down here. So now when I create this div, it's going to have a couple of different attributes. I can actually demonstrate that really quick before we do anything. So if we were to click something, you can see the div at the bottom here, the new div has image-window as a class and an onClick event called close image function. So going back inside our style sheet, I'm going to say I want to style this. And first of all, I want to give this a width. And the width is going to be 100 view width. So it's going to be the total width of the browser. Then I want to set a height, which is going to be the complete height of the browser. So 100 view height. And then I want to set a background color. Background color is going to be just a black color, I'm guessing. Hashtag 000. And I also want to set a position because I want it to be at a layer that is going to be on top of everything else on the website. So in order to do that, we need to create a position styling. So I'm going to set a position. It's going to be fixed. And then I want to say that from the top, I want this to start at 0. So it's going to go all the way up to the top of the website. And from the left, I want to start at 0. Then I also want to make sure that, well, actually, let's go ahead and just check this out before we continue. If I were to refresh, you can now see that now we get this little pop-up here. Once we do it, we need to refresh now in order to get it back to normal again. So now I can see whenever I click, we get this box that pops up. So the next thing we need to style in here is going to be the cursor, because I want to have a cursor icon once I do actually put my cursor on it. So it's going to be a pointer, which again is the hand symbol. Then I want to set a display flex, because whenever I insert this image inside this container here that is going to be shown, I want it to be centered inside this container. So I'm going to use that using a flex box. So I'm going to say I want to again justify. We could actually just sort of copy paste this because we did this already. Where it says flex up here, we're just going to copy the justify content and align items. So we're just going to paste it in. And then the last thing we need to do is I want to set a set index, which is going to be the layer in which this is going to be positioned. And I want this to be positioned at 100, just to give it some kind of high number. Once we've done this, and once we create the image, we need the image to be on top of this pop-up window, which means it needs to have a set index that is higher than 100. So I'm just going to do like 500 or something. So now that we have this, what we're going to do is we're just going to go and create the styling for the image once we insert the image into this container here. So below here, I'm going to copy, paste it in, delete all the styling, and inside the path, I'm going to say image. So image window class image, which means that right now we're styling the image that is going to get inserted inside the container. For this one, we don't need to have a lot of styling. I just want to set a max height and set it to 80 view height. And I also want to set a max width, max dash width to 80 view width. So basically what we're doing here is once we do actually display the image inside this container here, is I want to make sure it doesn't go all the way up to the top, and I don't want it to go all the way to the left and right. I want to make sure that it fits inside my browser window, but it shouldn't go all the way up to the top and sides. That's basically what we did there. So now that we have this, we actually have all the styling for the actual image. So going back inside our gallery, the JS file, which is going to be the JavaScript file, we can now insert the image inside the container we just built. So going down a couple of lines just to sort of separate the code, I'm now going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call this one new image. And we can basically just copy paste what we have up here, because I'm going to create a new element, which in this case is not going to be a div, but an image. And then we also need to do the same thing here. So I'm just going to copy the append child method. And we're just going to change a few things here, because now we're trying to insert the image inside the container we just built. So we're going to reference to the new image window, which we have up here. That's going to be what we insert the image into. And then I want to insert the new image inside the new window we just created. So having done this, we now need to set a couple of different attributes for this image, because we need to have, first of all, a source, so we can actually link to the right image that needs to get inserted. And we also want to have an ID for the image here. So I'm going to say we have a set attribute. So again, I'm just going to copy paste, and I'm going to change it so that it's the new image that gets a new attribute, which is going to be a source. So inside the path here, we're going to say we have an image folder that contains the images, / and then I want to link to the image that we grab from up inside the URL. So I'm going to copy this variable, and after the double quotes, I'm going to say plus set new image URL. So right now we do actually get an image. So let's go ahead and go back inside our website, refresh it, and there you go. Now we have an image that opens. Now there is one more styling thing that we need to have here, because the background is not transparent right now. So let's actually go ahead and change that. Going back inside our gallery.css file, we did actually say it had to have a black background. Let's actually go ahead and change that to something else. And instead we're going to include a RGBA color code, which means how transparent do we also want the color of the background to be. This is also a very neat way to add colors. So I'm going to say 0, 0, 0, 0.8. So the first 3 zeros is just going to be the color code for black. And then the last part here is going to be the transparency. So 0.8, which is almost completely black, but not quite. So if we were to go back inside the website, refresh, you can now see we can see the background through it. Okay, now the next issue is that we can't close the image. So that's also something we need to take care of. So if we were to go back inside our JavaScript file, you can actually see that if I were to go back up inside where we created the window right here, you can also see I included a on-click event called close image, which is the name of the function we need to actually run. So I'm going to go down and create a new function, and I'm going to call this one close image. So we're going to say we have a function, parentheses. Let's actually call this one what it's supposed to be. There we go, close image. And inside this function here, we're going to run one line of code that is going to remove, first of all, the actual window inside, the actual window that pops up inside the website with the image inside of it. So I'm going to say I want to go inside my documents, dot query selector, And I'm just going to grab one. So it's not going to be query selector all. It's just going to be query selector. Parentheses. And I want to grab a class called image-window. Because remember, the window that we created up here, right here, that has this onClick function inside of it, does also have a class called image-window. We made sure to include that. So we can actually say that we want to grab this and remove it. So we're going to run a remove method here. So now if I were to actually save this, go inside my browser, open up a window, and click, you can see we now close it down again. All the nodes inside the actual element here also gets deleted, so the image itself is also deleted, just to point that out. So it's not existing inside the website anymore. So going back inside our code, we also want to make sure that we can actually change images once we're inside the website. So that's going to be what we want to create next. So inside our code, up inside our main function up here, the one that actually opens up the image. After we create the new image, I want to also create a couple of buttons on the side of the image that I can click on. So in here, I'm going to say I want to create a new variable called new prev btn, which is new previous button. We're going to create a new button. I'm going to set it equal to create element. So we just copy paste from up here, essentially. And I want to create a anchor tag in this case here. After creating an anchor tag, I want to also go ahead and create a text node because I want some text to go inside this anchor tag. So I'm going to say I want to create a new variable called btn priv text. And I'm going to set this one equal to document dot create text node, which is right down there, parentheses. And now I can sort of decide what do you want to be inside this button here. Now do keep in mind our CSS styling might need to be a little bit different depending on the length of the word you use in here. In my case here, I'm just gonna write previous. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to append this text node to my anchor tag, which means I'm actually going to insert this text inside the anchor tag. So I'm going to want to grab the new prev button and then say I want to append child and append the text node, like so. So now that we did this, the next thing we need to do is we actually need to append the actual anchor tag to the actual document. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, we have this container up here, which is right now the document body. I'm just going to reuse that and then say I want to insert or append child, this new previous button. Like so. Then we also want to make sure that this previous button has some attributes inserted inside the actual anchor tag. For example, a class, an onClick event, because we need to be able to switch image, which require an onClick event. So I'm going to copy our set attribute up here and then say that I want to change or add an attribute inside the new previous button. So I'm going to paste that in instead and say I want to include a class. And this one is going to be called img-btn-prev, P-R-E-V. After doing this, I'm going to copy paste it one more time, this entire line here. And I also want to make sure I include a onClick event. So onClick, and in this case here, I want it to be called change img parentheses. Okay. Now, we also need to create one for our next button. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, paste it down here. Actually, let me paste it at the top there. I think that makes a little bit more sense. So in between here, I'm going to paste it in. And then we're going to change all the places where it says prev. We're going to change it to next. I'm just going to copy that, paste it in here, here. Make sure you change it over inside the actual text node text. I'm also going to change it down here inside the variable name, inside the append child. We also want to change it in both places. Then we also want to change it where we set the attributes. Make sure it says next inside the styling as well, inside the class here. And then the last attribute where we have the on-click event, we also want to make sure we change it there. So you just need to change all the places where it says prev to next. Now, there is one more thing we need to do here though, with these next and previous buttons, because we need to know the width of the actual image, because not all images are going to be the same width. If I were to open up this one, you can see it stops right here. If I were to open up this one, you can see it stops a little bit further out. So we need to make sure we get the full width of the image that we want to display in order to know where we want this button to be positioned inside the image here. Because if I were to go inside my live example or the finished version, you can see the next button is a certain spacing from the image, no matter the width of the image. And that's what I want to create. So we need to get the actual width of the image that is right now loaded inside the browser. So what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that I create something called a onload, which means that I need to wait for the actual image to be loaded before we run all this block of code down here, okay? Or this block right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, we have this image up here that we created and pasted in a little bit previously inside the code. I want to take that image and I want to check whether or not this image has been loaded by using an onload event. So I'm going to say onload equal to, and then I'm going to say I want to equal a function, parentheses, curly brackets, and then I want to insert all this code we just created for the previous and next button inside this function here. So this code here is not going to get run unless the actual image is done loading, because if we don't do this, we're not going to be able to grab the width of the image, because this code here is going to run faster than the image gets loaded, which means that since the image hasn't loaded yet, it's going to set the width of the image to 0 if we don't do this. So this is a very important step here. So after we have loaded the image inside our container, we now want to create a variable called image width and set it equal to this object, which means this image up here, dot width, which is a property that we can reference to in order to get the width of an object. So we're referencing to this image that is getting loaded and then getting the width of it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get the actual distance from the image to the edge of the browser. Because when we create these buttons and actually style them, we need to tell the styling how far from the edges should the buttons go. So depending on how wide the image is, they might need to move in further or not as far. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call this one calc image to edge. And then we're going to set this one equal to a calculation, because now we need to calculate the distance from the image to the border of the browser. So what we're going to do is I'm first of all going to take the window width, which is going to be the one that we stored all the way up at the top here when we created our first JavaScript code. That's going to be the width of the entire browser. And then what I want to do is I want to subtract the image width that we just got above here. So now that we did this, the next thing I want to do is right now I have the complete spacing from the image to the border of the browser on both sides. And I just need to have it on one side, so divide it by 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this inside parentheses. And then after the parentheses, I want to divide by 2. Now, when we do this, the buttons are actually going to be placed right at the edge of the images. We actually want them to not be on top of the images, but a little bit further out to the side. So I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this around parentheses again. And just for good matters, I'm going to go ahead and include a minus 80 pixel. And again, you don't need to write pixel behind it because it will actually mess it up. Just write minus 80. And then it's going to just move it just a little bit further out from the image there. So now it should be perfectly fine. So now that we have this, we need to take this variable, which is the calculation for where we want the buttons to be, and add that as styling to our buttons. So we go back down to the buttons, and I'm going to start with our next button here. And I'm going to say I want to grab the next button, and I want to reference to the style property of this button. And I want to add a CSS text styling that I'm going to set equal to double quotes. Now, before we create this styling, I do think we need to go back inside our gallery.css for this to make sense. So let's go ahead and go back in there. Just know that right now we're going to style the buttons that are going to get displayed inside our gallery once we open up one of the images. So inside our CSS file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, this is going to be the next image styling. And what I want to do, first of all, is I want to actually reference to the class called image-button-next, because that's a class we applied using the setAttribute method inside the JavaScript to the next button. So the next button has this class attached to it. Then I want to make sure I say display as block, because this is a anchor tag. So when we display it as block, or any sort of text when we display it as block, we can actually add a background to it by adding padding. So this is why I'm doing this. And then I want to say padding, 6 pixels from top and bottom, and 10 pixels from left and right. Then I want to add a border radius just to sort of smoothen out those corners of the button so it's not completely a square. So I'm going to say border radius, set it to something like 4 pixels. Don't want it to be too round. I think that might be too much. And then I want to set a background color. And I want to set this one to, not completely black, but something very close to it. So 111, 111. Then I want to set a position. And this is why I wanted to go back here and do this first, because we will set a position and it's going to set as fixed. Then I want to set a top, and I want to set it from the top of the browser. I want it to be 48 view height. It's going to be where the button is positioned from top to bottom. You can kind of eyeball that one. Going down here, the next thing we're going to add is the set index, because remember we set the actual container to 100. I want to make sure we set this one to something higher. So the set index is going to be 500. Then I want to set a font family because we want to style the actual text. And I'm going to set it to Arial again because I don't have any imported fonts. And I also want to set a color for this text here. It's just going to be white. And then the last couple of things we're going to do is we're going to add a cursor to a pointer. I don't think we need to include this, to be honest, but just let's go ahead and add it in for good measure. We're also going to set a text transform because I want it to be uppercase. So uppercase. And there we go. Now I do also need to add a hover effect because I want it to change once I hover my cursor on top of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy it here and say after the path, hover, and then just sort of change the opacity or something. You can change the background color, you can do whatever you feel like. I'm just going to change the opacity to 0.8. Now with this styling, I'm just going to go ahead and copy and then just go ahead and paste down this entire thing one more time. And now I'm going to change the styling to image button prev. And again, I just want to point out here that we're actually doing double styling because I'm not going to be changing any of the CSS inside both buttons here. So we are essentially wasting a little bit of styling here. We could, if you had to do it technically correct, add a ID to the buttons as well, and then have the class as the same name inside both buttons. So you could just do the styling in one place. Again, you can change that later if you want to. It doesn't really matter at the end here. So with these buttons here, I just want to go ahead and make sure I change the styling names or the path of these different buttons. So the second button is called previous instead of next. And now what I want to do is I want to go back inside my JavaScript file. Because remember, we set a position called fixed for these buttons here. What I want to do now is I want to take this calculation up here and I want to change the right styling because right is part of the position we styled inside the CSS file. And I want to set right to whatever we calculated up here. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to say right and then just write pixel in here. And then in between pixel and the actual property we have here, I want to say double quotes, plus, plus, and then add in the JavaScript variable. By doing this, we now added in this number here inside our styling. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste what we have here paste it inside our previous section down here. So we have the previous button style as well. And then I just want to make sure we change the new next button to new previous button inside the variable name. And instead of right, we want to say left. We do need to change one more thing here, which is I'm going to go ahead and not have a space right before pixels. That is something we want to make sure we don't have, otherwise it's not going to work out. It's not going to know that we're calculating in pixels then if we don't do that. So having done this, let's go ahead and go back inside our browser, refresh, and click one of the images. And now you can see we have the buttons going exactly where they're supposed to be. Now there is one thing though, because right now the buttons don't work. And if I were to actually close down the image, you can see we still have the buttons here. So what we need to do is we need to go back inside our code, and we're going to go inside our close image function down here. And we're going to go ahead and add just 2 more lines of code to close down those buttons there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste what we have here, paste it down 2 more times. And I'm going to say that I want to select a class that is called image or img dash btn dash next. And I want to remove it. Then I want to copy this, paste it in down here, and say I want to remove the previous button. So now if I were to go back inside the browser, refresh, you can now see that when I close it, we also close the buttons there. So now everything here works. The only thing is that we now need to be able to change images. That's going to be the next part here. So what we're going to do in order to change the images is we're going to go ahead and create a new function down here. And I'm going to go ahead and call this one function change img parentheses curly brackets. Now the reason I called it change image is because if I were to scroll up a little bit, you can actually see that when we did actually create these buttons here, I did create an on-click event called change image. And that's why we want to make sure we have a function called that. Now, what I will be doing here is I'm going to be passing in a parameter, because in order to know whether or not I want to go forward or backwards when I want to change the images, whether or not we click previous or next, I need to pass in a parameter here. So going back up inside our button JavaScript code here, inside the on-click event, I'm going to be adding 1 for going forward and 0 for going backwards. So going back down to my function down here, I want to make sure that we include this parameter inside the function. So I'm going to say change dir for direction. So this is the variable that is going to contain either a 1 or a 0, depending on which button I clicked. So what we can now do is going in here is I want to make sure we first of all, before we can change the image, remove the current image inside our website. Because when I have something opened, we don't want to have this image still here when I add the next image. So we need to close down this image first. So going inside our code, I'm going to go ahead and say we want to add we can actually go ahead and copy paste what we have up here. Document, query selector, and then add a remove method at the end there. And what I want to remove is an ID called current dash image, because that's what we added to the image once we created up here. You can actually see that we have, if I were to find the image we created, it is right here. Oh, okay, I can see we actually forgot to include that. So inside where we created the image, right on top of where we actually created the buttons, we need to include another set attribute, because we do also need to include a unique ID for this specific image here. So I'm going to say the new image is also going to have a new ID that is going to be set equal to, let's go ahead and delete what we have in here, just to make sure we don't get anything wrong. It is going to be set equal to current dash image. So now if we go back down to our change image function down here, we will now remove the image once we do actually click the button. So let's actually go ahead and go inside our website just to test this, click an image, and then you can see we removed the image there. Going back to our code, what we're going to do now is we're going to generate a new image, because now we deleted the image and we need to create a new one. And we need to do that depending on which image we currently deleted from inside the website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call this one get img window because I want to get the window right now that the image is inside of. And I'm going to set this one equal to document.query selector. And I want to select the window that has the class that is called img window, which again is just a class we added to the container for the image. So we're just grabbing that one so we can insert a new image inside of it. Down below here, I'm going to create a new image element. So I'm going to say new image. And I'm just going to say, well, actually a lot of this is just copy paste from above, but we're just going to go ahead and rewrite it again. So new image equal to document.create element. And then I want to say I want to create a new image, img. Then below here, I just want to add the image inside our window or the container. So I'm just going to say get image window and then run a append child. And then we're going to append a new image. So now we're going to be adding a new image element, but we haven't set the attributes yet because right now it's just an image, but it doesn't have any link to the new image or anything. So that's what we need to do now. Now, in order to calculate this, we need to know two things. What was the current image that we just deleted? And what is the button that we clicked? Did we click previous or did we click next? Because depending on that, we need to either get the previous image or the next image. So down here, I'm going to create a variable to start with, and this is not going to be equal to anything because we need this to just sort of be a container. And this is going to be calc new image. And we're going to close that one off. And then I'm going to create an if statement. And inside this if statement, I want to know what is change direction. So is it 1 or is it 0? Because depending on that, it is going to either go left or right inside our gallery once we change the image. So depending on this one, if change dir is equal to 1, then what I want to do is I want to go inside the if statement and say I want to grab this calc new image we created and set it equal to the get latest opened image, which is all the way up at the top here, which right now we set equal to 1 if you click the first image. If you click the second image, it's equal to 2. So we have that one stored depending on what image we just opened. So I want to set it equal to that one, and then I want to add 1 to it. Because now we're going forward, this is when we click the next button, so it has to be the next image in line, which is going to be the next number. After we've done this, I need to run another if statement, because what if the image that I open is the one at the very end? Because there is no image number 8. So what we need to do then is start it all the way over again. So going back inside our code, we need to go inside this if statement and say, well, if calc new image is greater than the gallery images that we have up here that contains all the images we just grabbed from the gallery, dot length, which simply says how many images do we have inside this variable up here. Right now we have 7. So if our new image that we're going to be loading in is greater than 7, then we need to start it over again. We don't want to go to number 8, we want to start it over. So I'm going to say we want to set calc new image equal to 1. So it's going to load the first image instead, okay? After the first if statement here, I'm going to run an else if statement. Because what if I didn't click the next button? What if I clicked the previous button? So change direction is going to be equal to 0 instead. And then what I want to do is I want to just simply copy paste what I have here inside the last if statement. And instead of adding 1, we're going to be subtracting 1. Then I also want to make sure we don't check if calc new image is greater than the length of how many images we have, but instead if it's lesser than 1. Because if I open up the first image, the current image is going to be having a number as 1. So if I were to go back 1, it's going to go to 0, and we don't want that to happen. So instead I want to make sure that the next image that I'm going to load is going to be equal to gallery images.length, like so. Because now it's going to open up the very last image that we have inside our gallery. So now that we did this, we're going to go ahead and set an attribute for our image up here that we created. Because now we know which image we're going to load up next. So we can actually do that. So I'm going to say we have this new image that I created. And I want to set attribute. And inside the attribute, I want to set a source to begin with. So source is going to be the first parameter. And then the second one is going to be the path to the actual image. So right now, I want to make sure I go inside my image folder. And then I want to load the one called image. And then we need to add the number of the image. So I'm going to add a JavaScript variable. So I'm going to get the calc new image. Then I want to add another string, which is going to be .jpeg. Now, if you're using anything besides JPEG and images, you might want to change this. I would recommend being consistent inside your website when it comes to your gallery images. Don't have JPEGs and PNGs mixed together. Just sort of stick to one. So depending on that, you might want to change these, JPEGs that we have here. Having this, we now need to add one more attribute because we need to set an ID for this image set to current image. Because remember, when we delete the image up here, we actually reference to, there we go. We reference to an ID set to current image. We had to remove the image in order to insert the next image. So we need to make sure that ID is also applied to this new image. So I'm going to say we want to reference to the new image and set a new attribute. This is going to be ID. And then I want to make sure this one says current dash img. So now that we have this, what I want to do as well is I want to make sure we update the latest image, because remember at the very top here, we're keeping track of which image was opened last. If this one doesn't update every time we change image, it's going to mess up the whole thing. So we want to make sure that we take the get latest opened image and we set it equal to calc new image, because that is going to be the index of the new image that we're opening inside what we have here. Now, the very last thing we need to do inside our JavaScript code, we need to make sure we change the buttons and their positions for the new images that gets loaded in, because not all images are the same width. So if I were to actually save this, just to sort of show you, open up this image here. Oh, it's actually not going to do it because we need to do something here. Before we can actually show this, I did actually notice one more error in here, which is at the very top of our change image function. This has to be inside double quotes, by the way, inside the very top where we create the get image window. We need to make sure we put this into double quotes. So the class image window inside double quotes, okay? So once we've done this, let's actually go back inside the website and refresh. If I were to open up one of the images, you can see once I change image, we change image, but the button stays in the same place. And the reason this is an issue, because you might think, well, this is sort of nice, then you can just keep switching, right? You don't need to move your cursor in and out. It's a better user experience. But the reason this is an issue is because if I decide to open up a image that is not so wide, and then change the image, you can see now the button is inside the actual images that comes after. And we don't want that to happen. So we need to adjust the actual button positions here. So going down inside our code, I want to make sure, first of all, that the image has actually loaded, like the new image has loaded up before we start changing the positions of the buttons, because we need to know the new width of the new image. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, well, we want to grab the new image we just created, and I want to run a onLoad event. And once it has loaded, I want to run a function. Now in here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called image width. And I'm going to set this one equal to this object that has loaded, which is this image, dot width. So this is exactly like we've done before, a little bit further up inside the code. Then what I want to do is I want to run the same calculation essentially. So we're just going to go up here and actually get the calculation. We could just have copied these two lines. It doesn't really matter. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing here. Now what I want to do is I want to create a new variable, and I want to call this one next btn for next button, and set it equal to document dot query selector. And I want to select the next button that we have here. So I'm going to say I want to look for a class called img dash btn dot dash next, and I want to change the position of it. So I'm going to reference to the next button that I just grabbed from inside the website. I want to add some styling to it, which is going to be CSS text, and set it equal to, we can actually go up here and actually sort of copy paste as well. So let's just go ahead and copy, the next one is going to be going to the right. So we want to change the right styling to the new calculation we just did here. So calc image to edge, like so. And then we just need to do the previous one as well. So instead of next button, it's going to be previous button. And then we just want to reference that right there. So now that we did this, let's actually go and go back inside our website. Refresh, and as you can see now, we have buttons that move. If we want to close the image, we just click on it, and now we close it down. So this is how we can create a gallery image. Or image gallery section that can open up images. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was very long for me to record. I don't know how long the video is going to be, but I've been sitting here for about almost 2.5 hours. So I hope it's not going to get as long when I edit it afterwards, but I hope you learned something here. At least you learned a lot of JavaScript when it comes to that. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.